Well, good morning. Glad that you each are here. Let me give you just a little couple of introductory remarks about the material for today. First of all, most of these lessons have what I call an interactive outline or message notes attached to them. And if you want to look at where that is, you should notice that there's a marriage that works. It's a one-page little sheet for you to take notes on, and then part 2 and part 3. So the reason why I put these message notes together is because about 60% of you are visual learners, if you're a typical audience. And so that's why a lot of people really like PowerPoint, something they can see visually. It's easier to connect with. And about 30% of people are oral learners, which means you get it mostly from the ear. And if you listen to a lecture or a sermon, then you'll remember it really well because you tend to focus in on the hearing aspect of learning. And then the balance of you are like kinesthetic learners. That's why you like to really take notes. And if you take notes and write things in the margin. I get a book, I like to underline it and all that, and I'll go back later and remember where that happened. And so there's something about actually writing when you're going through a message that helps you to recall the material. And it's also, of course, there for reference. So they found that if you have all three working at once, a good oral presentation, a visual presentation, and an opportunity to take notes, that's where you get the biggest bang for your buck, the most likely to have learning that is retained. So based upon that, I've given you an opportunity to take notes. But also, I have some detailed information on the back, which goes along with today's material, the keys for a successful marriage. You'll notice right after page 33, there is a new numbering of material. There's 12 pages that goes along with today's material. Now, there's more material in the handouts than we have time to cover in class, but I occasionally will make reference to that. So hopefully this is something you can take home, and I very much want to emphasize the equipping of the saints function of this seminar this weekend. I've spent 35 years seriously engaging in marriage counseling, and I've tried a lot of different things. And what we're talking about today seems to be the sweet spot. It seems to have been the most effective way to help couples that are struggling in their marriages and families. And so very little of this is original with me. I just tried all these different things that were out there, and by far this was the most impactful. I'd say over the years, about 80% of the couples who go through this process find that when they get to the end, they're pretty much ready to go on a second honeymoon. I mean, it's just so gratifying to help a couple that's struggling or a family that's struggling and help them not just survive, but thrive, and to do so to the glory of God. And it's really not that complicated. So my goal is, I'm assuming you're here on a Saturday morning. Most of you are pretty solid Christians, really good in the faith. And so you should be in a position where you're already a pretty good example, and you can then know how to help people. You don't have to be some professional counselor. It's not rocket science. And so I hope you'll think about other people you know that are having challenges in their marriages and in their families. Just out of curiosity, how many of you right now in your circle of influence, family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, how many of you know people that are having difficulties right now in their marriage and family? Wow, about almost half. I'm not surprised, because in our modern secular world, they're just giving people the wrong messages. And there's the myths that people buy into that makes it really hard for them to think once they're in trouble that things will never get better. And it's just not true. And so think about those people, pray about them, and see about maybe sitting down and talking with them about these very principles. And maybe you can refer them to the tapes and to the lessons online here as well. So there was a dietitian, and somebody came up to her one time, one of her clients, and said, I'm just curious, as a dietitian, what do you think is the one food above all that people ought to avoid eating, ought to just never eat if they possibly can? And she thought for a minute and she said, wedding cake. See, she had recently been through a rather acrimonious divorce, and so in her mind, the food you need to avoid is wedding cake. What a shame. The wedding cake is supposed to be something for celebration, at the covenant celebration that you have at the reception. Yet she, in her cynical mindset, thought that's what you want to stay away from if you possibly can. It reminds me of the bumper sticker that's out there. First time I saw this, I kind of thought, oh my, who in the world would wear that on the back of their car? If love is the wine of life, marriage is the hangover. Kind of a cynical view of love and marriage, don't you think? But there's a lot of people who have had difficulties and therefore got some rather, unfortunate comments to make about love and marriage. As we talked about in our class last night, about 20 to 30% of marriages fail within the first 2 years. That's just amazing to me, how quickly the person that you think is the love of your life winds up being something that you can't stand. You go from one extreme to the other. You ever thought about that? You're standing there at the altar, lost in each other's eyes, just so thrilled with such great hope for the future. And in less than 2 years, you're filled with sometimes hatred and bitterness, and you just can't stand this person that you once loved. How does that happen? And more importantly, how can it be avoided? I'm not just concerned, though, about the divorce rate. That's bad enough. I'm also concerned about what marriage and family researchers call the marriage failure rate. I mentioned last night that only 17% of couples that have been married for 10 years or longer report that they find their marriage highly satisfactory. That's just not good enough. And there's a whole lot of people who are married unhappily. And for whatever reason, they just hang in there the best they can. But they really, in their, quiet moments, are just filled with great hurt and disappointment that things didn't turn out in their marriage the way they hoped that it would. And sadly, in surveys, marriages of confessed Christians are just about the same as the surveys of people that are non-Christians. That just ought not to be. And so what can we do to try to turn this around? Well, that's what today's little 3-part seminar is specifically about. So you don't want to be somebody who just goes with the flow. I mean, if you just go with the flow and you decide that you're going to just do what everybody else does and have an average marriage, you're not going to have a very happy marriage because the average marriage is not really all that good. And so I don't know about you, but I don't want to have an average marriage and family. In fact, I don't want to have just above average marriage and family. I want to have a marriage and family that gives glory to God. I want to have a marriage and family that is exemplary in every way possible. I want everybody to be in that top tier, because otherwise your theme song is going to wind up being that of the Righteous Brothers. Remember that classic song? You never close your eyes anymore when I kiss your lips. There's no tenderness in your fingertips. You've lost that loving feeling, and it's gone, 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 and something really precious is gone. Amen. And so too many people are married, but they've lost that loving feeling. What a tragedy that is. And remember, when the glory of God is at stake, mediocrity is not an option. Amen? So, we're talking today about a marriage that works. It didn't work for that dietitian. It doesn't work for a lot of people. The problem is not God's divine plan for marriage. The problem is people are not executing things in the proper way to make their marriage and family blossom. So what is really the key? The key is that both parties must learn to care and protect the marriage in a practical way. The thing I love about this material is it has broad applications to every interpersonal relationship, not just to marriage. What I mean by care is you listen carefully, discern what your spouse's needs are, and then develop habits to the best of your ability to meet those needs. And then secondly, you're also wanting to avoid hurting or offending your spouse. I call that making withdrawals from the love bank, if you possibly can. And if you're successful in this, then you're generally going to have a happy marriage. As a young preacher, I had people come to me and they would have, real serious marital difficulties, and I didn't really know how to help them very well. I just have to tell you, it was a real weakness of my ministry. And I decided I wanted to do everything possible to take that weakness and turn it into a strength. So I got some extra education, and I did a lot of research and reading. And as I said, I experimented with a lot of different things. And of all the different things that are out there, obviously I wanted something biblically based and something that was practical. What I'm sharing with you today is by far the most helpful. So, you're probably familiar with this. I noticed in Brent Romine's study that he had a copy of His Needs, Her Needs. This is just a classic book. I think they've had over 3 million in print. My mother just turned 95 yesterday, had her birthday. And for many decades, she gives couples a copy of His Needs, Her Needs, because it's one of her all-time favorite books. And a book that goes with this is something that's not as popular, but that is, I think, extremely useful and just as essential. And it says at the bottom of the book, Love Busters, this is how to protect your marriage from the marital habits that destroy romantic love. And so you've got these two different elements. The first is, what can you do to care for the other party by really being concerned and focused on meeting their needs? And then secondly, what can you do to protect the other party? Protect them from harm, the habits that destroy romantic love. I want you to think about how you can add the principles of these two books to your sort of arsenal to help you defeat the fiery darts that the evil one is directed against our homes today. However, as you know, this is just a book written by a man, and though he claims to be a believer, I have to tell you there are several things about the books that I think have some glaring weaknesses. And the reason I put together the 12-page handout, which is a summary of Harley's material, is I've added about a lot of Bible verses, a lot of enhancements, and I just want you to be aware of some of the weaknesses. And some of my preacher friends have seen some of the weaknesses and just kind of thrown all this out, and that's a mistake. But I want you to be aware, if you get these books, and I hope you do, you can pick them up for $5 or $6 a used copy on Amazon. I mean, these are just excellent resources for insights for your own marriage as well as to help others. An obvious weakness in Harley's books is that he doesn't really talk about or mention spiritual needs. And obviously, for the Christian family, that's right there at the top, right? This, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all these things shall be added unto you. So whenever I go through this material, I always want to focus on the spiritual needs as a primary focus. He doesn't do that in the book, but you can certainly do that. And secondly, it doesn't teach male servant leadership, which the Bible clearly teaches. Certainly marriage is a cooperative enterprise, and a couple works together as husband and wife, but somebody's got to be the tiebreaker. Somebody's got to provide the leadership. And he doesn't do that. He doesn't talk about male servant leadership in the book. And he uses scriptural principles. I mean, they're all through the book. About 90% of this is just biblical principles applied in a practical way. And sometimes he even quotes scripture, but he doesn't put any of the scriptures in his books. And so I just go through and add all the scriptures because they are used but not cited. I asked Harley about this, and he said that he didn't want to limit his books to just the Christian audience. So he knows that these are Christian Bible principles, but he didn't want to turn people off that wanted help with their marriage that were not Bible believers. So he chose to leave it out, which shame on him. But at any rate, I just want you to be aware of some of the weaknesses, even though overall these principles to me are just golden. And so the 12-page handout on the back is just called Key Concepts That Make a Marriage Work. And these are my enhancements to Harley's material. And so today we're looking at, the intro at 9, and then at 10 we'll look at overcoming love busters. And those are things that harm a relationship. And then the final lesson will be on how to meet each other's needs. And of course, after each one, I'll be giving you a kind of a homework assignment so you can apply this at home. So today we're going to look at the love bank, the key to passion. I mean, that's what everybody wants. How do I keep my love alive? How do I keep the passion going? How do I maintain that loving feeling? Well, the love bank is what will explain to people how to do that. Then there's the romantic myth, which we'll talk about. Very dangerous, and a lot of people, maybe even some Christians, buy into this, and I want to expose that for the falsehood that it is. Then I want to talk about the importance of habits so you can truly be compatible. And I'll be watching the clock. If we have time, I'll introduce briefly the principle of love busters, which will prepare us for our second session. Obviously, from a biblical perspective, when we talk about love, we need to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. That's, of course, the love chapter. I like to think about love as like this white light. And you take white light and you shine it through a prism, and you wind up having the beautiful colors of the rainbow. There's 8 key elements of love that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 13. And I like to think of Paul taking love and just shining it through the prism, and then you come up with this beautiful kind of collage of colors with these 8 actions that demonstrate that someone is truly a loving person. And please notice, when you look at 1 Corinthians 13, it has nothing to do with how you feel. It's everything to do with how you act. Love is a verb. Bottom line is you love somebody based on how you choose to treat them. So, as you're familiar, love is patient and kind, does not envy or boast, it is not arrogant or rude, does not insist on its own way, it is not irritable or resentful. Does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. True love never fails. And so I think these principles are just simply practical applications of these actions that a person demonstrates towards someone else. All right. Now, so where's the feeling come in? These are just the actions. Remember, you can love your enemies. You don't necessarily have warm feelings towards your enemies, but you can still have active goodwill toward them. But you don't want just active goodwill toward your spouse. You want passion. You want love. You want affection. People get married for love, right? And so should they. So the love bank is the idea that when you meet a person, you sort of set up an account in your mind with their name on it. And if you just meet them and you don't really know them, you don't really have any emotional attachment to that relationship. I mean, they're just an acquaintance. Now, hopefully, you have some interactions with them over time, and you get to know them, and you start to think of this person as being one of your friends. And you have now an emotional component toward this person. You either like them or you don't. And the more interactions, the more you have sort of an intensity of those emotions. If the person is sort of funny and you share a good sense of humor, or you're like my namesake here, Brent Romine, we find out we have the exact same personality type, and no wonder we're on the same page about almost everything. It's just really cool to talk with Brent and to find out how much we have in common, in addition to wearing the same first name, right? And so you have, these high kind of emotions associated with this person, and you look forward to future interactions so you can have more good times of connection. And so the idea is the intensity of the feeling increases as long as you have positive exchanges. And Harley calls that making deposits of love units. And so the more positive exchanges, the more you begin to feel connected to this person. But of course, over time, and this is particularly true in marriage, there are times when you find yourself frustrating or irritating or disappointing your spouse. I mean, that's a part of living together. That's a part of life. And those are negative exchanges. And so if you have too many of those negative exchanges, too many withdrawals, and not enough deposits, then your feelings for that person begin to diminish. I mean, it's like with a checking account. If you're always writing checks out of your checking account, but you're not making big deposits periodically, what happens? Well, you wake up one day and you're out of money. Well, that's what happens in the love bank emotionally when you wake up one day and you realize, I don't love this person anymore. What we mean by that is I don't have the passion or the emotional intensity or the feelings for this person that I once had. And that's kind of scary to feel like that the love is gone. You've lost the loving feeling. And the reason is the love bank is empty. Well, sadly, what happens if you continue to disappoint or to ignore or to take each other for granted, and you're not looking for opportunities to meet each other's needs and to make deposits, but you continue to make withdrawals? Well, if you continue to write checks and there's not money in the bank, you're going to hear from the bank, and you're going to be in the red, and you're going to have to pay all these penalty fees, and things are bad. And eventually the bank account is sort of shut down altogether. And that's when the feelings go from I don't have feelings for you anymore to I don't like you anymore. And sometimes you even get to the point where you hate this person. Who wants to be stuck in a relationship that's until death do you part with someone you don't even like or even hate? And over time, anger and animosity can develop if you're continuing to make withdrawals and you're not understanding the need to continually also make deposits. And see, what also happens here is that if you're dating and things are going really well and you're really enjoying each other's A-sides, right? Then one of these days, in that scenario, you think, I think I'm falling in love with this person. We've all been there. And you think of the future, and you can't think of the future without this person being in it. I mean, that was the key when I knew that I wanted to marry Gail. I just so was enamored with her, I couldn't think of a future without her. You been there, done that? I mean, that's what leads to eventually someone deciding to get engaged. Let's make this permanent, right? I enjoy all these love units coming in all the time and very little withdrawals. And man, this is going to be marital bliss if this is going to be what my future with this person is going to be like. So you reach this threshold of love units where you kind of emotionally become obsessed with one another and you, quote, fall in love, and you can't get this person off your mind. It's because the love bank is higher with this person than perhaps it's ever been with anyone else. And you're just kind of on cloud nine. And that's the way romantic relationships start. When the love bank is high, romantic love is born. The problem is, how do you maintain that romantic love? In the beginning stages, there's this natural instinct to please. But again, the problem is you start off with this rather large balance in your love bank, but if you're not conscientious to make sure at the end of every year there's more deposits than withdrawals, then your marriage begins to turn stale, and it's not what you wanted it to be. And the reason why you feel the way you do is because of simply what's going on with your emotional love bank. You need to remember that though love is a very strong motivation, and it is certainly an extremely important part of our life, God is love, and when we have a relationship with Him, then we love as God loves. But it's also, especially romantic love, is very fragile. It's like a plant that looks great, but if you neglect to water it regularly, it's going to wilt and eventually die. And so oftentimes life happens and kids come and there are pressures in the job and you start focusing on all these other things except each other. And when you neglect to have quality time and to speak each other's love language, eventually you run out of deposits from the high balance that you begin the relationship with. And as I mentioned, when the love bank is empty, that's when you kind of realize, I don't really love this person anymore. What you really mean by that is, I don't have feelings for this person like I used to. And that's kind of scary. And when that happens, frankly, that's when you are tempted to have an affair where you're going to be around somebody else that's going to make you feel better and start putting deposits in your love bank. And when it's overdrawn, that's when you have anger, and that's where you have a lot of difficulty. And by the way, understanding this principle of making deposits or making withdrawals and all of that, it becomes a great communication tool. Ever since my wife and I learned about this, this just is the way we communicate with each other. Now, if I do this for you, I'd rather not do this, but I know you've expressed you want this. If I do this for you, is this going to be a big deposit in the love bank? Or is this really not that big a deal? On a scale of 1 to 10. On the other hand, I know this isn't your preference, but I'd really like to do this. Is this going to be just a kind of minor withdrawal, or am I really in trouble here if I go ahead with this? What do you think? And sometimes I just wake up in the morning and I say, what can I do to fill up your love bank? What can I do to make some big deposits today in my wife's love bank? Boy, let me tell you, she's got answers. Usually it's help her with her chores because she's, a service-oriented person. That's kind of her love language. So doing things for her around the house and things like that is what puts the bounce in her walk and the sparkle in her eye. I don't really understand why those things are such a big deal to her, but that's the point. She's different than I am, and it doesn't matter. I love her, and so if it's important to her, it's important to me, right? And vice versa. So I passed out this one-page handout here, which I encourage people to put on their refrigerators because it's a little one-page sheet that summarizes what the love bank is really all about. And so you've got the deposits over here on the left, and then on the right you have the withdrawals. And every day you need to think, what can I do to avoid making withdrawals and make sure that I'm conscientious about making deposits? So that's why I passed out that extra sheet, because it can be used for that purpose. Now, let's talk about the romantic myth that I mentioned earlier. There's several aspects to this, but I want to talk about one particular aspect now, and then we'll talk about another one later. People have this idea that once you fall in love and you found what we like to talk about as our soulmate, you think, man, I've found Mr. Right or Mrs. Right. Of course, one person said, when I found Mrs. Right, I didn't know that her first name was going to be Always, but that's another issue. Once you possess it, you feel like you're never going to lose it. I mean, every single time you go to a wedding and the couple is so excited about getting married, and you can just see it in their eyes. They're just beaming toward each other. And it's just really neat to watch. And you tend to think, we have this love, this kind of emotional obsession at that point in your life, honestly. And this is so special and so real. I mean, a lot of times you think you have something that really no one else has because it's so unique. It's not unique at all. Anybody who's been married has been there when you stood at the altar. But you have this idea that regardless of the statistics out there, this is going to just be great and it's going to last until death do us part. People have this idea that once you fall in love and you possess it, this is the real thing and we can never lose it. That's really naive because a 50% divorce rate ought to be enough to let us know that, yeah, you can lose it, or there wouldn't be so many people who after a while are unhappy with this person that they stand at the altar with and want somebody else. So that is just not true. You have to understand, yet what we have is really wonderful, but it's also very fragile, and like I said, it's got to be watered and tended to, and you have to keep your thoughts about the love bank in mind all the time, or over time you're going to just slowly take each other for granted, not have good communication, and the love will kind of leak gradually out of the marriage. You don't want that. So that is a terrible myth. And the other part of this, kind of the corollary to it, is people think once we lose it, it can never be regained. People often come to me with counseling, and almost always it's because the love bank is not only empty but overdrawn. And they just panic. They feel hopeless. And they think, well, once we've fallen out of love, it's over. And I got married for love. I don't want to be married to some person I don't really care for anymore. So they think the only solution is to bail on the marriage and go and find someone else they can, quote, fall in love with. Well, the irony of it is that people tend to marry the same personality types that they married the first time. And the same thing happens in the second and the third and the fourth marriage that happened in the first. Only every other time you marry, you're less likely to be happy because you bring all this hurt baggage from the past relationships into the new relationship. And it makes a whole lot more sense just to work on the first marriage and learn how to get that love bank balance back up so you will feel good about being in the relationship than to thinking the solution is, I just married the wrong person. See, the other part of the romantic myth is there's about 8 billion people in the world, and people think that I've just got one person that is right for me. I've just got to find my soulmate. And you think you found it, and then when you fall out of love, people think, this isn't the one. I married the wrong person. Oh, what am I going to do? And so oftentimes they bail. And it's all on this myth. No, there's many people that you could be happily married to. Don't think about the fact there's only one person out of 8 billion that you could be happy with. That's just absurd. It's a lie of Hollywood and the movies, and Satan just has a field day because people feel certain ways based upon beliefs, many of which are not true and not biblical. But the thing I want to focus in on is this idea of once you lose it, it can never be regained is just a huge lie. Over and over again, I've seen that if you follow this little process I take you through, that romantic love can be reborn and the feelings can come back with a vengeance. It's amazing how a repaired marriage can truly be better than it ever was. The key is to what the withdrawals are, identify the love busters, and stop doing it. Stop making withdrawals, hurting the other person, annoying the other person, frustrating the other person. If you're doing that, stop it. Develop habits that are complementary to the other person and their needs instead of things that are an antithesis to what they want. And then Start making deposits. Figure out what your spouse's needs are and go out of your way to meet them. And guess what happens when you're not making withdrawals and you start making deposits? What happens to your bank account? It starts going up and up and up. And if you can learn how to develop patterns of compatibility, then you know what happens? Every year, you're more in love with your spouse than you were the year before. It's like the song, I love you more today than yesterday, but not as much as tomorrow. And that's my wish for every married couple. And it's really not that hard to figure out. And so what we need to be telling people, my first marriage counseling session, my goal is for them to come in all frustrated, arms folded. Oftentimes, the woman especially, her eyes are kind of sullen and dark. You can really tell where a person's coming from by looking in their eyes, the windows of the soul. And I have compassion for people who've given up hope. It's one thing to be walking along the beach holding hands in this romantic setting, and then one day you feel like you're handcuffed to this person, and you're stuck in an unhappy relationship with a person you don't even like. Listen, feeling trapped in a loveless marriage is difficult. And to just tell people, well, just stick through it because, you made this vow and they haven't been unfaithful, and so just hang in there. That is not very good advice. You got to tell people more than just hang in there. I don't want things to just survive. I want them to thrive. I want us to have marriages that glorify God. And what you do when you understand the paradigm of the love bank, you go, oh, there's things we can do where things can be much better. Jesus says all things are possible with God. Paul says, I can do all things through him who strengtheneth me. It's not a verse to quote before a sporting event. I don't really think God cares too much about who wins a football game. But I'll tell you what, when you're struggling with keeping your vows and with a marriage, that's when you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. That's when you need to have hope. But you got to have a path to run on. And when I study with couples, it's almost always Christians because I want to deal with this from a spiritual perspective. And if people don't agree, there's no point in us counseling. And so one guy was telling me, he said, with all due respect, our love is just dead. It's been dead for a long time. And I said, let me ask you something. Do you believe in the second coming of Jesus and that he's going to come and he's going to bring forth a general resurrection from the dead, both the righteous and the unrighteous, and we're all going to have to stand one day before God in judgment, but that one of these days we're all going to come forth from the tomb? Do you believe that? And people go, well, of course, that's very foundational to our faith. I said, okay. So you believe in a God that can resurrect the dead. Well, don't you think if God can resurrect your dead body one day, that he can take a marriage that's love has died and resurrect your love? Of course, remember, we serve a God that specializes in the resurrection from the dead. And so if your love is currently dead, don't think it has to remain that way. And then you explain about the love bank and how things can be turned around. And they leave with hope because they got a track to run on. They know what to do. What they've been doing hasn't been working, but this is something different. And it takes deep communication. And I said, let me serve as your coach, and I can guarantee you if you'll follow this process, you'll come out of here and you'll start having the feelings return. And you'll want to be with one another. They won't be handcuffs anymore on the beach. They'll be walking along, enjoying each other's company. And that's what God wants, and that's what marriage is all about. There are two sides to marital conflict. Couples either fail to make each other happy by not meeting each other's needs, failure to care or make deposits, or they make each other unhappy by failing to protect by stopping withdrawals. And so let's talk about that. And let's figure out how we can fix this thing. Listen carefully to this. I am your constant companion. I am your greatest helper or heaviest burden. I will push you onward or drag you down to failure. I am completely at your command. Half the things you do might just as well be turned over to me, and I will be able to do them quickly and correctly. I am easily managed. You must merely be firm with me. Show me exactly how you want something done, and after a few lessons, I will do it automatically. I am the servant of all great individuals, and alas, of all failures as well. Those who are great, I've made great. Those who are failures, I've made failures. I am not a machine, though I work with all the precision of a machine, plus the intelligence of a human. You may run me for profit or run me for ruin. It makes no difference to me. Take me, train me, be firm with me, and I will place the world at your feet. Be easy with me, and I will destroy you. Who am I? This powerful force. I am habit. Men make the habits, habits make the men. A habit is a cable we weave, a thread of it every day, and at last it cannot be broken. And the concept of habit is biblical. We're told to exercise, discipline ourselves into godliness. 1 Peter 4 and verse 7. My father's favorite memory verse, Proverbs 16, verse 3, commit thy works unto Jehovah, and thy purposes, thy habits, will be established. And make level the paths of thy feet, and all thy ways will be established. So most people are unhappily married because they have habits that harm the marriage instead of habits that help it to grow. And so that's the key. Communicate clearly without defensiveness. What are you doing that hurts my feelings? Or how are you meeting or not meeting my needs? And the key is to really listen and just be determined to develop new habits as you apply the golden rule. I mean, isn't that what you want your spouse to do for you? So you do it for them. And the key is, look at that one-page handout on the Love Bank and stay focused on that instead of just reacting and taking things so personally. So what do you need to do to be happily married? Learn to habitually meet each other's needs. Now, I find this fascinating. There's 4 stages to this. First, you're unconsciously incompetent. You're in an unhappy marriage, you're not meeting each other's needs. You don't wake up in the morning and say, what can I do to make a withdrawal from my spouse's love bank today? What can I do to hurt my spouse? No, you don't do that. But that's what you're doing when you continue to do things that annoy, irritate, and frustrate your spouse. So I call that unconsciously incompetent. You're just not as compatible as you thought you were. But then when it's pointed out and you communicate these things clearly, now you become consciously incompetent. Because bad habits are hard to break. And you continue to do these things, only now hopefully there's a little pang of conscience because you recognize, oh yeah, this is something my wife doesn't like. Here I am doing it anyway. Because it's hard to break habits. And so now hopefully over time you say, okay, I'm going to stop doing this. And it only takes about 8 weeks to develop a new habit. That's the good news of this. And so first you're kind of consciously incompetent, and then as you start improving and start doing the things your spouse wants, now you become consciously competent. You have to think about it. And then after a while, it just becomes second nature to you. And guess what? Now you are unconsciously competent. You just be yourself. It takes work to have a happy marriage. You can't take it for granted. And now you're compatible and irresistible. Sometimes people look at the marriage that I have with Gail and they think, you are so lucky. And I go, you are so wrong. And they go, what? And I said, luck has nothing to do with it. First of all, I don't believe in luck. I believe in every perfect gift comes from God. So I've been blessed. Don't talk about luck. But I said, secondly, I want you to realize that we've been through a lot of struggles in our marriage, especially in our early marriage. And we didn't get to the point where we're at just because it just came naturally. We both had to work on it. until we can become pretty much unconsciously competent and enjoy each other's company more than anybody else's in the world. Didn't start that way. First 4 or 5 years were pretty difficult, frankly. And I'm glad I found this kind of paradigm so we could turn things around. And I want to do that for others. Now, the love busters is a destructive marital habit, which is a repeated behavior that causes the other spouse to be unhappy or to withdraw love units. Question is, what do I do first? Well, that's an important question. Do you show the couple how to start meeting each other's needs? Or do you first start focusing on the things they're doing to harm the marriage, to make withdrawals? When you make withdrawals and you hurt the other party's feelings, walls of resentment create emotional divorce. I think it's page 9 of your handout. There's a little test you can take where you test to what degree you're emotionally divorced from your spouse. Passion is when the walls are down. You feel completely comfortable in each other's presence. And the key is to avoid those barriers. The walls are your enemy. So you need to keep the walls down. And the problem is, it's the love busters that create the offenses in the walls. So that's where you need to start your journey. It's kind of like parenting. We're told, provoke not your children to wrath. So the first thing is, don't over-discipline for small offenses. Don't unnecessarily frustrate your children. Don't provoke them to wrath. But instead, nurture them in the discipline and admonition of the Lord. So in this case, what does Paul say you're supposed to do first with your children? Get rid of the love busters. The reason is, if you put your arm around a teenager and they pull away, that shows you there's a big wall up, right? They're not going to let you teach them and admonish them and nurture them if you've got walls of resentment that have come between you and your teen, for example. So Paul says, stop the things that are provoking your children to wrath, and then you'll be able to nurture them. In marriage counseling, the first thing you want to do is explain the love bank and what's going on, and then say, let's focus first on the love busters. And these are just practical applications of love and honor, which are, of course, throughout the Scripture. So that's why these things are so biblical. So I repeat, both parties must learn to protect and to care for each other in practical ways. God does not want you to feel like wedding cake is dangerous. He wants you to celebrate your relationship, not just at the wedding, but throughout your married life. Okay, that's the end of our introduction. Let's take about a 7 or 8 minute break. We will meet back here at 10 o'clock. Please get up and move around. That's what research says will help you to rejuvenate your attention span. So visit and have a good time, and I'll see you in about 8 minutes.